Good afternoon, Pittsburgh Steelers fans. Welcome to another edition of Steelers Brunch with Tony. I am your host, Tony Defio, and I am so excited that you guys are joining me again. Last week, it was a lot of fun. My first show, I thought it went really well. I received a lot of great feedback, a lot of love from you guys, and I'm looking forward to doing it again. Before I begin today's show, I just want to encourage you, as always, to subscribe to Behind Steel Curtains YouTube channel. A lot of great podcasts, plenty of podcasts on a daily basis. There's just last night I listened to Yeah, I Said It, Lance Williams, the famous Lance Williams, his weekly podcast. He's also on The Standard is the Standard every week with Behind the Steel Curtain editor Jeff Hartman, and they're often joined by Brian Anthony Davis, the famous Bad. Brian is my co-host every Monday for Steelers Q&A at 5 o'clock. That's in the off season, and in the regular season, it is called Steelers Hangover, where we discuss the previous day's Steelers game. There's also the Stat Geek, hosted by Dave Schofield, the deputy editor of Behind the Steel Curtain. He's often joined by his big brother, Big Bro Sco. I met both Dave and Big Bro Sco last December, along with Brian Anthony Davis, right before the Bills game, which ultimately was the downfall of the Steelers season, but we won't get into that. But anyway, we have a lot of great podcasts that, again, you can watch and subscribe to on a daily basis. And, of course, there's the site Behind the Steel Curtain, where you can find all the Steelers news you need every day. Jeff Hartman and Dave, they bring the news every time there's a breaking story. You can always count on them to bring it to you. And then, of course, there's commentary. Guys like me and Brian Anthony Davis, we provide a commentary. And then there's there's film breakdown. There's everything you need. It's the greatest, in my opinion, the greatest Steelers site on the internet. So please, again, subscribe to this page, the Steelers, or the Behind the Steel Curtain YouTube channel, and like this page. So let's get on. And before I start, hello to everybody who's saying what's up. Kenneth there, Ezra, Dennis Sheridan, the famous Dennis Sheridan. It's going to be a fun show. And what I want to talk about today is life after Ben Roethlisberger. You know, the belief held by many, including me, for the longest time, is that once Ben finally retires, being a franchise quarterback, it's going to be hard to replace him, because those guys are hard to replace. Let's not kid ourselves. You know, we went 20 years between Terry Bradshaw and Ben, and we had a lot of okay quarterbacks in the middle, but certainly no franchise quarterbacks, and certainly no Super Bowl success. And again, if you look at teams like the Dolphins, the Broncos, teams that have had the Bills, teams that have had franchise quarterbacks, it's not always easy to replace those guys. So why should the Steelers be any different? And again, that was my thought process for the longest time, until recently when I watched an episode of Caught in the Draft that chronicles. It's a show produced by NFL Films that chronicles many of the drafts from the past, and the drama that led up to it, the drama that went on during the draft, and the aftermath. And I think it's a really good series. You should check it out on YouTube or the NFL Network. But the show I want to focus on is the 2004 draft, the great quarterback class 2.0. You know, 83 we had John Elway, Dan Marino, Jim Kelly, etc. Well, 2004 it was Eli Manning, Phillip Rivers, and Big Ben Roethlisberger, who the Steelers drafted with the 11th pick of the 2004 NFL draft. So I think that draft and the 7 years that followed for Pittsburgh taught the Steelers a lesson on how to rebuild after a championship era, or after your franchise quarterback retires or leaves. In the case of Terry Bradshaw, who he retired, but you know, it was more injury than anything else, and it was kind of unexpected. But how did this? If you remember that draft, if you remember Dan Rooney, the owner, the patriarch of the franchise at that time, Manning and Rivers were gone, and Bill Cowher, the head coach at the time, he really loved Phillip Rivers. He wanted to draft Phillip Rivers. There was a thought that he might slip down to 11th, but he was drafted 4th by the Giants, who ultimately traded him to the Chargers, which I'll get into later. So when it came time for the Steelers to make their selection at 11, there was talk of going in another direction, getting an offensive lineman for Tommy Maddox, who was a starter at the time. And that was believed to be what they were going to do. But Dan Rooney kind of interjected and said, look, we haven't had a chance to draft a quarterback this high in a long time. We haven't had a chance to get our hands on a franchise quarterback. We should go quarterback. And he was ultimately the deciding vote, and the rest is history. So again, I think that selection and the success that happened taught them a lesson on how to rebuild, because I'm not sure if they necessarily knew that the first time around after that first Super Bowl era of the 1970s. And fair enough. The Steelers for 40 years, as we all know, they did nothing as an organization. They didn't come close to winning any titles. They were just another team. Excuse me. As much as it might pain me to say and pain you to hear, the Steelers were basically the Browns of their day. They were just a sad sack franchise. And then boom, starting in the late 60s, they had a whirlwind of success. Dan Rooney became the driving force of the organization. He hired Chuck Noll as head coach. Noll immediately drafted Mean Joe Green. And then over the next 5 years, he drafted and signed. We can't forget about Donnie Shell now. He was an undrafted free agent in 74 who the Steelers signed. He's now a Hall of Famer. So they drafted and signed 9 future Hall of Famers. And of course, this bared the fruit of 4 Super Bowls by the late 70s. They were the marquee franchise of the NFL. They were the standard bearer of success. And then, boom, in 1980, it was all over. Everybody started getting old. People started to retire. How did they rebuild? What did they do? And maybe the initial thought was with the quarterback, because they drafted Mark Malone in 1980. But was he the answer? Was he a franchise quarterback? Well, obviously not, because by 1983, he couldn't even beat out longtime backup Cliff Stout in the first attempt in years to replace Terry Bradshaw, who was out that season, or the beginning of that season, with recovering from elbow surgery. He would only, as it turned out, he would only play one half of one game before retiring after the 83 season. But Malone couldn't even beat out Cliff Stout by his 4th year, so he obviously wasn't the answer. He did become the starter in the mid 80s, and he did okay. He was probably better than people thought, but he certainly wasn't great, and he certainly had his bad moments too. So, in the meantime, what did they focus their draft on in the 80s? And their first round picks. Well, four picks they used on defensive linemen: Keith Gary, 1981; Gabe Rivera, 1983; Darrell Sims, 1985; and Aaron Jones, 1988. In 1982, they drafted Walter Abercrombie in the first round, running back out of Baylor. He was obviously brought in to be the successor to the heir apparent to Franco Harris, who was in the twilight of his career at that time. He would go on to play another 2 or 3 years for them, and then that would be it. So there you go. Were they thinking quarterback, or were they thinking something else? That the old school thought in those days that a lot of coaches had, a lot of general managers, a lot of scouts was that you win with defense and running the ball. Chuck Noll famously said in 1983 during the draft, when they were debating whether or not to take Dan Marino with the 27th pick, what did he say when he decided to take Rivera instead? We built this thing with defense the first time. We're gonna do that again. We're gonna build this thing a second time through defense, and that was the mentality in those days. Running the football, defense. That's how you win. Let's go through the rest of the first round picks of the 80s. 84, Louis Lips, receiver. Great pick. Can't argue with that. 86, they picked 9th. It was their highest selection in the first round since 1970 when they took Bradshaw number 1 overall. They picked John Reenstraw, a guard from Temple. He didn't really have much of a career. 87, Rod Woodson, cornerback. Can't argue with that one. In 89, the Steelers had 2 first-round picks, and they were coming off a 5-11 season. Their own first-round pick that they earned on merit was the 7th pick in the draft. That was their highest pick since Bradshaw, and they used it on a running back, Tim Worley out of Georgia. And I'm not knocking the Steelers for that, because that was he was believed to be a really good selection at the time. He was believed to be a possible franchise running back, the kind of guy you could build a team around. And that they went, and Bobby Brister, by that point, he was considered the heir apparent, the starting quarterback. He started in 1988. He started the entire season, even though they were 5-11. He was believed to be the future at quarterback. So it's hard to argue, but at the same time, coming off a 5-11 season, maybe you should be looking at the quarterback position as one you want to upgrade. Moving on to that second pick, which they got in the Mike Merriweather trade, 24th overall, they picked Tom Ricketts, offensive tackle from Pitt. So if you look at the Steelers after they drafted Malone in the first round in 1980, here's how they used 3 picks to draft quarterbacks the rest of the decade. I mentioned Bobby Brister in 1986. He was a 3rd-round pick. Some guy named Rick Trucano, they picked him in the 11th round in 1981. And then, of course, the famous Scott Campbell, they picked him in the 7th round in 1984. He actually went on to start a few games for them in 1985. But he really had not much of a career. So basically, Noel spent the entire 1980s, I don't want to say neglecting the quarterback position, but certainly he wasn't making it a priority beyond a few selections, and no higher than the 3rd round. In those last 2 drafts, he picked Eric Green, tight end, in 1990, and then, of course, the famous Huey Richardson, the edge pass rusher, outside linebacker, in 1991. Those were his last 2 drafts. And then even Cowher, his first few drafts. In 1992, he picked Leon Searcy, a tackle. 93, Deion Figures, cornerback. 94, Charles Johnson, wide receiver. And in fairness to him, though, he did inherit Neil O'Donnell from Chuck Noll, who drafted him in the 3rd round in 1990. And we don't remember Neil O'Donnell very, very fondly, but he was not a bad quarterback. He was actually a pretty good quarterback in the early to mid-90s, and the Steelers made the playoffs every year with him as a starter. So it was hard to argue with Neil O'Donnell. But was he a franchise guy? Obviously, if you remember Super Bowl 30, he didn't do so hot when everything was on the line. And if you remember the 94 AFC Championship game against the Chargers, there might have been 1 or 2 passes we wish he could have made to win that game. But in fairness to Cowher, he did draft Cordell Stewart in the 2nd round in 1995, and he was brought in to be the successor, the heir apparent to O'Donnell, who was not going to be around much longer. He was a free agent, and he was probably going to leave after 95, which he did. The Steelers didn't keep their free agents in those days. So Stewart was brought in. He was slashed in the beginning. He was a receiver, running back, occasional quarterback, but he was brought in with the belief that he would take the Steelers starting job sooner rather than later. O'Donnell left after 95. He was immediately replaced by Jim Miller, who the Steelers picked in the 6th round in 94. He lasted all of a half of the first game of the 96 season before Cowher benched him in favor of the veteran journeyman Mike Tomczak, and you never heard of Jim Miller again. I think he's a radio personality now, but as far as his football career with the Steelers, that was pretty much it for him. So Tomczak, he went in, and he was a nice game manager in 96. He took the Steelers to the playoffs again. They won a game. So I could see Cowher going with Tomczak. And then in 97, he went with Cordell finally won the starting quarterback position. And he did a good job. 97 was a great year. He was an exciting player. He had a great year under Chan Gailey as offensive coordinator. Took him to the AFC Championship game. But then Gailey left after the season to be the Cowboys head coach, and that's nobody's fault. I mean, you can't deny a guy the opportunity to get to take a head coaching job. And in 98, Gailey was replaced by Richard Sherman. That was a disaster. He lasted 1 season. 99, Kevin Gilbride was brought in. He lasted 2 seasons as a coordinator. By that time, Cordell's confidence was slashed, so to speak. He was benched by the end of the '99 season. He was not only benched by Cowher, but he was prevented from going to the quarterback meetings. He was basically a receiver by the end of the year. He wasn't even a backup quarterback to Tomczak. He was just a receiver by that point. He eventually got his job back in 2000, had another great year in 2001 under Mike Mularkey. He was his fourth offensive coordinator as a starter. But unfortunately, by 2003, he was out of Pittsburgh in favor of Tommy Maddox, who took his job in 2002 and had a really great 2002 season. But if you remember those times, even though there was a lot of uncertainty with Cordell starting in '98, there's a lot of turnover at offensive coordinator. The Steelers really did not address the quarterback position that half a decade, from '98 through '03. They drafted, I think the only guy they drafted in that entire time, well, two guys. They drafted T. Martin, 5th round in 2000, out of Tennessee, and they drafted Brian St. Pierre in the 5th round in 2003. So not much dedication given to the quarterback position through '03. And then finally, 2004 comes along. Ben gets drafted, becomes a starter almost immediately, and the rest is history. And that takes me back to that 2004 draft. If you remember that draft, how the drama that was unfolding before it took place, Eli Manning, who was the consensus #1 pick heading into that draft, made it quite well known, him and his father, Archie Manning, they made it well known that they had no interest in playing for the Chargers, who had the #1 overall pick. So what wound up happening was Eli did get picked by the Chargers. Philip Rivers went 4th, and then, of course, Ben went 11th. The Chargers and the Giants made a trade. They swapped quarterbacks, and as you know, the Giants and the Steelers had great success. They won multiple championships, and the Chargers really did nothing with Rivers. They had some good teams, but they did nothing. So in retrospect, I'm thinking Eli and his dad, they were onto something by not wanting to play with the Chargers, because even though Philip Rivers, he passed for 59,000 yards in his career, great career. He's going to the Hall of Fame. And if you look at the stats of Ben, Eli, and Rivers, they're all pretty much the same. But two of those guys are Super Bowl champions 2 times over each, and one only made it to one championship game in his career with the Chargers. And Rivers is the second Hall of Fame quarterback that the Chargers have had since the merger. Dan Fouts was the first. And if you remember Fouts' career, if you know anything about his career, he was the quarterback of some of the greatest offenses ever, especially for that time. And yet they could never really get anywhere. But I think they made one AFC Championship game during Fouts' career, and that was it. So I think not only did the '04 draft teach the Steelers that, look, if we're gonna win championships, we need a quarterback. We need to build with the quarterback first. Yeah, defense is important. The running game is important. Skill position players are important, but we need the quarterback above him. We really have to. We can't neglect that. If we're going to build an entire team, we can't just neglect the quarterback and hope that we can go all the way. It's not going to work. And I think they were always committed to winning, even though they struggled a bit in the early '80s. Even though they neglected the quarterback position for 2 decades, really, they were committed to winning. They may be just a little flawed in their thinking on how to build a team and what to address first. But they were, again, they had a winning tradition, and so did the Giants. And I think once they finally got their hands on a franchise quarterback, they knew what to do with it. They knew how to succeed with it, whereas the Chargers didn't. And I'm obviously just guessing, but I think had Rivers wound up with the Giants or the Steelers, I think those two teams still would have had the same, maybe not exactly the same kind of success, but they still would have had championship success. I don't want to paint all 3 of these guys with a broad brush, to quote Mike Tomlin, and because they all have distinct characteristics, distinct traits that make them special in their own right. And I'm not saying that Rivers would have came here and made the tackle in that Colts divisional game, or or made the exact same kind of throw to Santonio Holmes, or had that game-winning drive at the end of Super Bowl 43. But I think they would have known what to do with a really good quarterback, even with Phillip Rivers or Eli Manning, whoever they would have wound up with in that draft. They would have still had championship success. And whoever went to the Chargers, whether it be Eli or Big Ben, they probably would have struggled to win. They would have had success. They would have had great stats, but I'm not so sure they would have actually won any championships, because I don't think the Chargers have ever been fully committed to winning like the Steelers and the Giants have always been. So, and I hate to disparage the quarterbacks that were here between the early 80s and the time Ben got here, because I mean they had some good years. Again, Neil O'Donnell was probably better than people want to remember because of that last game that he played, the Super Bowl, and Cordell had his moments, but he never got them over the hump. And Mike Tomczak was pretty good. Even Bubby had his moments. I'll never forget 1989, that playoff run. Tommy Maddox had a nice little cup of coffee here. 2002, he had a really magical. It ended in a nice little magical playoff run. So I mean, they had some decent quarterbacks, but they were never franchise quarterbacks. And if you look at some of those 90s playoff matches, you had O'Donnell trying to outgun Troy Aikman in the Super Bowl, a future Hall of Famer. You had Mike Tomczak even trying to outplay Drew Bledsoe in the playoffs the following year. And Bledsoe is not a Hall of Famer, but he was one of the premier quarterbacks of his day. And then, of course, Slash trying to outgun John Elway in 97. So the Steelers, they fielded a lot of great teams in the 90s and the early 2000s. They had some of the best rosters in the NFL, but it seemed like more often than not, they would go into the playoffs with the second best quarterback. And it more often than not, they would come up short until they got Ben. And then again, they had tremendous success. So if you look at I'm not trying to say that having a franchise quarterback guarantees success. It doesn't guarantee anything. But it's like what Terry Bradshaw said to Dwight White in practice back in the mid-'70s before he became Terry Bradshaw, a Super Bowl winning quarterback. He was still struggling to make it. I guess Dwight White hit him in practice for, I guess they were allowed to do that back then. And Bradshaw got mad and said, "Look, you might lose with me, but you'll never win without me." And I think that Bradshaw, of all people, summed up perfectly what it means to have a franchise quarterback and how important that is. I mean, the defense can get you here, the running game, everything, it'll get you so far, it'll get you to a certain level. But unless you have that guy under center or in the shotgun, you're probably not going to have the success that you want. So, again, I'm not saying the Steelers are automatically gonna because they're the Steelers, are going to go out and find themselves a franchise quarterback. But I do think once Ben does retire, they're going to make it a priority. They're going to go out and they're going to realize that, look, this is where we have to start if we're going to be a championship team. We have to start at the quarterback position. And maybe it's Mason Rudolph. A lot of people have their doubts. But if it isn't him, they're going to go about trying to find somebody who could take his place. They're not just going to leave it to chance. They're not going to draft a bunch of guys in the third, fourth, fifth round and hope that they win the job. They're going to invest in the position in the first round, because they went almost a quarter of a century without drafting a quarterback in the first round. And I don't think it's a coincidence that when they finally did, and they finally got the guy that they wanted, they were able to parlay that into championship success. So those are my thoughts on life after Ben. And now I want to hear your thoughts. I want to open things up to questions and comments and see what you guys have to say. So give me your best shot. Let's see what you got. See if I can scroll through some of these. See if I can find an old question. Oh, new comment. Okay. Let's see. This is a comment from SDJ63. The Steelers are already scouting their next quarterback. Maybe they are. Maybe they are. But I don't see them drafting a quarterback, again, as I've said many times, in the first round until Ben retires. I think as long as he's here and healthy and his old self, I think you have to try to do whatever you can to build the team around him and keep that championship window open as long as possible. Here's one from wrong one. Sorry. Do we trade up next year? Sorry, bear with me. I'm still learning to be the producer. Anyway, do we trade up next year to draft a quarterback? I don't think so. If Ben retires after this year and they feel that Mason Rudolph isn't the guy, then yeah, I could see them being aggressive next year and trying to find Ben's heir apparent. But let's say the Steelers rebound this year and win a bunch of games, win the division, or make the playoffs anyway, and have a nice long run. And Ben decides he wants to come back next year. And Ben, by the way, has a great year along with their success on the field. Do you think they're going to be aggressive and try to bring in an heir apparent when they still might feel as if they're one or two players away from winning another championship? So I don't see them trading up. If Ben's still here next year, I don't see them being aggressive and finding an heir apparent. Here's a super chat question from Vodka Drinker. I got this one right, thankfully, because it's a $6 donation. Thank you, Vodka Drinker. Well, it appears Green Bay hates Aaron Rodgers. If Ben can't go, I say make a move for Rodgers. It would fit cap-wise as well. Well, that kind of goes to my point about where they're gonna put their priorities after Ben's gone. I said this a few weeks ago on the Monday Q&A show with Brian. Perhaps instead of drafting a quarterback in the first round right after Ben retires, maybe they feel like they have a ready-made team. Like they already have a great defense. Maybe, if they still have that great defense after Ben goes, and they're missing nothing but the quarterback. Maybe they go the route of the Broncos in 2012, and Peyton Manning became available, and they sign a veteran quarterback to sort of keep that Super Bowl window open even after Ben is gone. And if that's Aaron Rodgers, if he still has it, if the Packers decide to move on from him for whatever reason, maybe they're in love with Jordan Love, no pun intended, then yeah, I could see them doing that because the Steelers have done many unsteelers-like things in the last few years. They traded up to get Devin Bush. They traded a first-round pick to get Minka Fitzpatrick. They signed Joe Hayden. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Joe Hayden a few years ago, right? The second he was released by the Browns, they signed him to a lucrative deal. These are things that they really didn't do in the past. So I could definitely see them being aggressive again, because I think the first Super Bowl era, when that was over in the 80s, they maybe didn't know what direction to go to win. I think they were more content back then with just starting over and, again, building with defense and running the ball and hoping the quarterback situation would take care of itself. Whereas now I think their philosophy's changed a little bit. At least I hope it has, or I'm confident that it has. And they will prioritize the quarterback first always. Not that you neglect the other positions. You need an entire team to win. I mean, I just mentioned Phillip Rivers. He had a great career and with the Chargers, but they never really surrounded him with a great team, and they didn't have the success. I mean, I think you need the two of them. But again, if you don't have the quarterback, I think you could have everything else in place, and it's not going to get you over the top. So that's what I'd say about that. Allie Howard says, don't replace an old quarterback with an old quarterback. Well, it all depends. I mean, I wouldn't replace Ben with Joe Flacco or somebody that's on the downside, or Andy Dalton, or anybody that's kind of on the downside of their career. But if it's somebody that's just had to move on because his old team was infatuated with a recent draft pick like Jordan Love, then that's a different story. It's provided Aaron Rodgers still has enough in the tank. If he has enough in the tank to play 2 or 3 years, then why not? I mean, all you're doing is replacing Ben's salary with his salary. It's not like it's going to be much different. You're just replacing one future Hall of Fame quarterback with another who might have a couple more years left of elite play. I mean, Peyton Manning played really well between 2012 and 2014. In 2015, he pretty much hit a wall, and that was it. But after he was waived by the Colts, he had 3 more great years. I mean, they set records in Denver during that. I think the 2013 Super Bowl team that lost to the Seahawks, they set offensive records. So he still had enough. So I'm not going to rule that out. But I mean, my belief is they're going to go the route of finding a guy in the first round. That's where they're going to concentrate their efforts, at least initially. So apparently Big Bro Sco said something awesome. So thank you for your contribution. I didn't see what you said, but I'm sure, as always, it was very insightful. Let's see. Let's put one up by Darren Dalton. Should one of the Steelers' top focus be on finding a way to trade themselves up into the top 5 for a top quarterback prospect in next year's draft? Well, I kind of addressed that already. It all depends. If Ben is kind of done after this year and they don't have any faith in Mason, then yeah. But if they have a great playoff run and they get close but no cigar, or if they win the whole thing and Ben still wants to come back, then no. I think they have to concentrate their efforts on still trying to win as long as Ben is around. So let's see what else we have here. I'll take a few more. Let's see. Try to scroll back and see if I missed any. Let's see. Here's one from Ezra. Can you imagine Trevor or Fields throwing to Claypool and Juju? Whoa, yeah, that would be great. That'd be great. But obviously, in order to get those guys, it would probably mean a very bad 2020 for the Steelers. So, do you want to sacrifice the last couple of years of Ben to get those guys? And no quarterback's a sure thing. I mean, Ryan Leaf is a perfect example of that. Jamarcus Russell. I mean, there are plenty of studs that have come into the league that have done nothing. So I think we have to remember that Ben's a proven commodity, and I think we owe him the benefit of the doubt as far as being able to take them to some special places over the next couple of years while he's still here. So, well, I think I'm going to wrap things up now. I thank you for the questions. I thank you for joining me for my second edition of Steelers Brunch with Tony. I hope it was a good show. I hope you enjoyed the Steeler talk, and I will see you Monday with Brian Anthony Davis for another edition of Steelers Q&A. You guys have a great weekend. Thanks for joining me.